It began on a cold November morning in 1957 in the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place so ordinary, so still it could have been forgotten by time itself. But behind the silence, something unspeakable was waiting to be found. When Bernice Wardens went missing from her hardware store that morning, no one imagined that her disappearance would uncover one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. Her truck was gone, her shop door left open, and the cash register was empty. But on the counter sat a single receipt, made out to a man everyone in Plainfield knew. Ed Gein. To the townsfolk, Ed was harmless, a quiet, awkward man who did odd jobs around town, helped neighbors with repairs, and kept mostly to himself on his lonely farm outside of town. He wasn't the kind you'd fear. If anything, he was the kind you pitied. But that night, when Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies drove to Gaines' farmhouse, they walked into a nightmare that no one, not even hardened lawmen, could have imagined. The house was dark, the windows covered with boards, the air thick with a stench of decay. Inside, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rooms filled with filth, clutter, and the remnants of a life long detached from sanity. Then came the discovery. In a shed behind the house, Bernice Wardens was found, hanging upside down from the rafters, decapitated, her body gutted like a deer. What followed inside the house would shock not just Wisconsin, but the entire world. Room by room, the deputies uncovered a scene so grotesque it defied belief. Human skulls used as bowls, chairs upholstered with human skin, a belt made of nipples, masks fashioned from the faces of women. There were boxes filled with bones, organs stored in jars, and an entire human head found in a paper bag. It wasn't just murder. It was desecration. A museum of the dead, curated by one man. The kitchen table was littered with old magazines, pornography, and anatomy books. In a back room, a lampshade, made of human skin, cast a dull yellow glow. Nearby, a corset sewn from a woman's torso hung like a costume. Investigators stood frozen, unable to process the scale of what they were seeing. Some ran outside to vomit. Others simply stared. And in the middle of it all stood Ed Gein, small-framed, quiet, almost polite. When questioned, he didn't run, didn't fight. He just spoke softly, as if none of it surprised him. He admitted to killing Bernice Wardens, and then, almost casually, confessed to another woman's death, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had gone missing 3 years earlier. But it didn't end there. When asked where the rest of the remains came from, Gein's answer chilled him to the bone. He had been visiting cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried women who reminded him of someone. When investigators pressed him for who that someone was, they gave a name that few recognized at first. But that name would explain everything. Augusta Gein. In the days after Ed's arrest, psychiatrists, reporters, and detectives all asked the same question. How does a man become this? Ed Gein wasn't a war criminal or a city predator. He was a farmhand from rural Wisconsin, raised in isolation, surrounded by endless fields and silence. He wasn't known for violence, but for his awkward gentleness. And yet, he had turned his home into a slaughterhouse. To understand the madness of Ed Gein, investigators soon realized they had to look deeper, beyond the corpses and the grotesque artifacts, into the one relationship that defined his entire existence. The one person who ruled his life long after her death. His mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. She wasn't just the woman who raised him. She was the architect of his world, the voice in his head that told him what was holy, what was evil, and what was damned. Before Ed Gein ever picked up a shovel or a knife, Augusta had already carved her beliefs into his soul. And in the end, it wasn't madness alone that created the monster of Plainfield. It was devotion. Twisted, absolute, and eternal. To understand Ed Gein, we must first step back into the world that built him. Back to the year 1878. To understand the monster, we must first understand his maker. And Augusta Wilhelmine Gein was not the kind of woman time easily forgets. She was born on July 21, 1878, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, to German immigrant parents, strict, religious, and proud. In those days, religion wasn't a matter of comfort. It was law. Sin wasn't something you stumbled into. It was something that hunted you, waiting for the weak to fall. Augusta learned early that purity came through discipline, and discipline came through fear. Her father, a devout Lutheran, taught her that the world was a wicked place filled with temptation, and women, he warned, were its instruments. Augusta carried that belief like a torch through the rest of her life. It burned everything it touched. When she married George Philip Gein in 1900, she expected a God-fearing husband who shared her moral code. What she got instead was a man she despised. George was an alcoholic, unemployed, aimless, often drunk by noon. His failures only hardened Augusta's contempt, convincing her that men, too, were weak and sinful. But in Augusta's eyes, her purpose became clear. If the world around her was poisoned by sin, then she would create her own kingdom of purity within the walls of her home. She would be its preacher, its law, and its God. She and George had two sons, Henry, born in 1901, and Edward Theodore Gein, born on August 27, 1906. From the moment Ed entered the world, Augusta claimed him not as a son, but as her instrument, the one she would mold into righteousness. In 1914, the Geins moved to a 155-acre farm just outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, isolated, surrounded by marshland and endless fields. For Augusta, isolation wasn't a hardship. It was salvation. No neighbors, no temptations, no women of low morals. Just her boys, and her God. Inside that farmhouse, the Bible wasn't just read. It was weaponized. Every night, Augusta gathered her sons to read Scripture aloud. Not verses of hope or forgiveness, but of damnation, judgment, and sin. She preached that women, except herself, were instruments of the devil. She told her sons that lust was evil, that desire was sin, and that the world was drowning in filth. And while Henry grew skeptical over time, Ed absorbed every word like gospel. He saw his mother as pure, holy, a woman chosen by God to guide him. In his eyes, she was never wrong. She was the truth. Outside the home, Augusta allowed her sons only minimal contact with others. They attended school, but socializing was forbidden. No friends, no parties, no laughter. Augusta often humiliated Ed for trying to connect with other children, especially girls. She called them whores, temptresses, and distractions from God. To her, love was contamination. And for Ed, love became confusion. Augusta's control was total. She ran the house, managed the money, dictated every action. When George's drinking worsened, she berated him in front of the children, calling him worthless and a failure of a man. Ed watched as his father withered under her voice, the voice that could command, destroy, or bless. When George died in 1940, Ed was 34 years old and still completely under his mother's dominion. Henry, the elder brother, had begun to rebel. He often criticized Augusta, telling Ed that her faith was too extreme, her hatred unhealthy. He worried about Ed's blind devotion. But to Ed, Henry's words bordered on blasphemy. His loyalty was absolute. Then, in May 1944, a brush fire broke out near the Gein farm. The brothers went out to control it, but when the fire died down, Henry was nowhere to be found. Hours later, Ed led police straight to his brother's body, lying face down in the marsh, oddly untouched by fire. The cause of death was ruled accidental. But investigators noted something strange. Henry's head had bruises. No one asked questions. The case was closed. But for Ed, it was the beginning of a new life, one where his mother was all he had left. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered her first stroke. Ed nursed her obsessively, tending to her every need, as though she were a living deity. He spoke of her to townspeople with reverence. But beneath that devotion was fear of losing her, fear of being alone. After recovering briefly, Augusta suffered another stroke and died on December 29, 1945. Ed's world ended that day. At the funeral, witnesses said he stood silently, expressionless. But after she was buried, something inside him broke. He boarded up her room, sealing it like a shrine, and began to live only in a few dirty rooms of the farmhouse. Everywhere else was frozen in time, just as Augusta had left it. Her presence never left him. He claimed to hear her voice. Sometimes he said she spoke to him, scolding him for thoughts of sin, commanding him to stay pure. But purity, to Ed, had taken on a new meaning. If he could not have his mother in life, perhaps he could bring her back in another way. After Augusta's death, Ed's descent into madness was slow but deliberate. He began reading about anatomy, cannibal tribes, and Nazi experiments. He became obsessed with death, not as horror, but as closeness. He started visiting cemeteries, digging up bodies of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother, dressing their corpses, preserving their skin, trying to recreate her. His crimes were not of lust, but of longing. Each body was an attempt to resurrect Augusta, each horror a twisted act of devotion. In his mind, she had never truly died, she had simply changed form. When investigators later asked why he made those grotesque masks, it gave a simple answer. He wanted to become his mother. In the quiet aftermath of Augusta's death, the seed she had planted, fear, guilt, isolation, bloomed into monstrosity. What she had built as a fortress of faith had become a tomb of madness. And her son, the one she had tried to keep pure, became the embodiment of everything she feared. When Augusta Gein died in 1945, something inside her son did not grieve, it fractured. Her death didn't free him. It hollowed him. In the years that followed, the lonely farmhouse on the edge of Plainfield became a mausoleum, a monument to a love that had curdled into obsession. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Inside, Ed Gein was losing his mind. After his mother's burial, Ed retreated from the world. He stopped farming, surviving instead on odd jobs, handyman work, mowing lawns, and occasional babysitting for neighbors' children. He was polite, soft-spoken, and seemed harmless. In a small rural town where everyone knew everyone, Ed's oddness was tolerated, even pitted. He would visit town occasionally, often stopping by the hardware store, the tavern, or the local dump, collecting discarded tools and reading material. His favorite topics: anatomy, death, and human experiments. Neighbors noticed he'd changed, talking to himself, laughing quietly when no one was around. His house fell into ruin, filled with junk, rot, and decay. But one room remained sealed, Augusta's. Pristine. Sacred. The rest of the house was filth and darkness, yet her bedroom stayed untouched, a shrine to the woman who had once ruled his life. For Ed, she hadn't really gone. She was still there, in the walls, in his dreams, in his conscience. And he wanted her back. Inside the Gein farmhouse, investigators cataloged over 40 human body parts, turned into household items. They found a human skull's turned into soup bowls, a wastebasket made of human skin, a belt decorated with nipples, a masks made from female faces, some preserved with lipstick still on them, a lampshade crafted from human flesh, a corset sewn from a woman's torso, and in a cardboard box, the preserved head of Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who had vanished in 1954. At first, the police believed these items must have come from dozens of murders. But Ed's confession revealed a darker, stranger truth. He had killed only 2 people, Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens. The rest, he claimed, came from graves. Mary Hogan was last seen alive on December 8, 1954, at her tavern in Pine Grove. Her bar was found empty, with blood on the floor and a bullet casing near the counter. Locals joked that maybe Ed Gein had taken her, a comment that would later haunt them. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Bernice Wardens vanished from her hardware store in Plainfield. A single receipt with Ed's name on it led police to his farmhouse. That night, the nightmare unfolded. Both women were killed by a single gunshot. Their bodies were mutilated post-mortem, skinned, gutted, and preserved. Ed confessed calmly, saying he had chosen them because they looked like mother. He insisted he didn't mean to be cruel. He just wanted to make a woman suit, something he could wear to feel closer to Augusta. It was in his mind, not murder. It was resurrection. After his arrest, Ed was examined by psychiatrists at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. The diagnosis: schizophrenia, psychosis, and severe sexual repression. He spoke openly without shame about his actions, detailing how he'd exhumed bodies, carved their skin, and made masks he would wear around the house. He admitted to becoming his mother, imagining her voice, feeling her presence. He said he had conversations with her in the empty rooms of the farmhouse. Dr. George Arndt, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated him, later said, Ed Gein lived in a twilight between the living and the dead, between guilt and longing. His mother's voice was still alive, and he obeyed her. His fixation was not purely sexual. It was devotional. Ed Gein's crimes were acts of worship, grotesque attempts to bring back the only person he ever loved and the only one he ever feared. In 1958, Ed Gein was found legally insane and committed indefinitely to Central State Hospital. During his trial, which lasted only a week, The defense argued that his crimes were not driven by hatred but by mental illness and delusion. He was never executed, never imprisoned in a traditional sense. He lived out his remaining years in hospitals, often described as quiet and cooperative. When asked if he missed Plainfield, Ed would say softly, "Not really. I still hear her sometimes." He remained institutionalized for the rest of his life. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, at age 77 from respiratory failure due to cancer. He was buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery, a final chilling symmetry. When news of Ed Gein's crimes broke, America was stunned. The idea that such monstrosity could exist in a place so ordinary shattered the illusion of safety in small-town life. Reporters poured into Plainfield. Psychologists studied him, and storytellers began to reimagine his darkness through fiction. In Norman Bates in Psycho 1960, the dutiful son dominated by his mother's ghost. A Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974, the masked killer surrounded by human remains. A Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs 1991, sewing human skin to become someone else. All born from the same true story. One man, one house, and one mother's voice that never died. What made Ed Gein terrifying wasn't his brutality, but his ordinariness. He wasn't a monster from the shadows. He was the man who fixed your fence, the neighbor who helped you carry your groceries. And behind his small, nervous smile lived the echo of his mother's commands, words that outlived her, words that remade him. By the time Ed Gein died in 1984, the world had long turned his name into legend, whispered in movies, written in novels, referenced in nightmares. But behind every retelling, every piece of horror inspired by his crimes, one figure remained half seen in the shadows, the woman who made him. Augusta Gein. Psychologists who studied Ed Gein agreed on one thing. His crimes were not about bloodlust or violence in the traditional sense. They were about control, the same control Augusta had once exercised over him. In life, Augusta had dictated what he could read, who he could speak to, even what he could think. In death, she dictated what he became. Her words were scripture, her image divine, her approval unreachable. And when she died, Ed's world collapsed, because without her, he had no self. The woman he worshipped became the void he tried to fill. Each grave he robbed, each mask he made, each horror he constructed was an act of devotion. He wasn't killing to destroy. He was trying to restore, to reassemble the only person who had ever mattered. When psychiatrists asked why he had skinned faces, he said he wanted to be inside her skin. It was both literal and symbolic. He wanted to inhabit her, to become her, to silence the loneliness that came when her voice was gone. To understand Augusta's power, one must understand the world she came from. Late 19th and early 20th century Wisconsin was a land of strict morality, especially in Lutheran communities. Alcohol was sin. Lust was sin. Independence, even curiosity, could be sin. Augusta didn't just inherit that faith, she amplified it. Her sermons to her sons were not about salvation, but punishment. She read them verses from Proverbs and Revelation, passages about damnation and impurity. She described women as vessels of corruption, said the world was doomed, and warned that every act of pleasure was an act against God. Ed absorbed those lessons completely. But the mind of a child doesn't separate belief from reality. It takes both as truth. To Ed, women became both sacred and forbidden, desirable and damned. And when Augusta died, that contradiction turned violent inside him. Her death removed the only barrier between fantasy and action. The rules she built to keep him pure became the framework for his madness. He did not break her teachings. He lived them, distorted and literalized, until sin and salvation became one and the same. The farmhouse itself became an extension of Ed's psyche. The boarded windows, the locked doors, the untouched rooms, all symbols of control, preservation, and denial. One half of the house was chaos, filth, decay, evidence of a mind unraveling. The other half, Augusta's half, was untouched. Clean, sacred, silent. When investigators entered that space, they found her Bible, her furniture, her linens, all perfectly preserved, as if she might walk back in at any moment. For Ed, she never left. He told police that he often sat in her room just to feel close. He believed she watched over him, guided him. Sometimes, when the loneliness was too much, he'd hear her voice. She told him to stay pure. She told him to avoid sin. And when her voice faded, he went to the cemeteries to find her again. Ed Gein's relationship with his mother became one of the most studied cases in forensic psychology. It was a textbook example of extreme maternal dominance, where a child's individuality is replaced by obedience so total that personality ceases to exist. Augusta didn't just control Ed's actions. She shaped his identity. Every belief, every fear, every moral compass he had pointed back to her. And when she died, he lost not just a parent, he lost his concept of good and evil. Without her voice, he was adrift. In that void, delusion took root. Dr. Harold Schechter, a historian of American violence, later wrote, Ed Gein was not a man driven by the devil, but by devotion. His atrocities were an act of grief, not greed. His mother's shadow was longer than her life. Plainfield, Wisconsin, never truly healed. The farmhouse stood for nearly a decade after Ed's arrest, a dark monument to everything the town wanted to forget. Locals avoided the road leading to it. Children were warned never to go near it. In March 1958, the house was set on fire and burned to the ground. Some say it was arson, others call it justice. All that remained was ash and silence. At the auction for Ed's belongings, a local man bought his car, the one he used to haul bodies from graves, and turned it into a carnival attraction. For 50 cents, people could sit in Ed Gein's school car. The line stretched around the block. Even in death, he drew crowds. But for the people of Plainfield, the story wasn't about entertainment. It was about betrayal, that evil could live undetected, that a neighbor could turn his grief into desecration, that faith could become a weapon. In the end, Ed Gein's story isn't just about a killer. It's about the thin line between devotion and destruction. Augusta believed she was saving her son from the world's sin. In doing so, she created a man who could no longer tell the difference between purity and corruption. Her control became his madness. Her faith became his ritual. Her death became his purpose. It's easy to call Ed Gein a monster, and by any measure he was. But monsters are not born in a vacuum. They are shaped, fed, and molded, often by hands that believe they're doing good. What happened in that farmhouse wasn't just the failure of one man's mind. It was the failure of love twisted by control, of faith warped into fear. In his own words, Ed once said, "When I think of Mom, I remember how good she was, and how she told me things. I guess I just wanted to keep her close." Those words, spoken softly in a hospital room decades after his crimes, carry the weight of his entire life, a life trapped between devotion and damnation. Ed Gein's grave lies in Plainfield Cemetery, just a few feet from his mother's. Over the years, the headstone was vandalized, chipped away by morbid visitors who wanted a piece of infamy. Eventually, it was stolen entirely. Only a bare patch of grass marks the spot now. Side by side, mother and son lie in the same soil, bound by faith, fear, and the legacy of horror they left behind. Augusta's voice may have died with her, but her influence lives on. In the psychology textbooks, in the film she inadvertently inspired, and in every whispered tale of the quiet man who lived with ghosts. The story of Ed Gein is a warning, not just about madness, but about control, isolation, and the power of belief. It's a reminder that love, when poisoned by fear, can create something far worse than hatred. Augusta built a world without sin, but in sealing it, she sealed her son's fate. And when she left him, he did what he had always been taught to do: obey the voice that lived in his mind. In the frozen soil of Wisconsin, two graves lie side by side, one for a mother, one for her son. The world remembers him as a killer, a ghoul, a monster. But perhaps, in the quiet between those graves, lies the truest horror of all. That before Ed Gein ever learned to kill, he first learned to obey. If stories like this make you question how darkness takes root in ordinary lives, remember to subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the human soul behind the horror. Each story reminds us, evil doesn't always begin in the shadows. Sometimes it begins at home.